We're talking to John from Texas. John, you are live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for taking my call. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you just fine, John. What's going on?
Fantastic. So I'm only calling because I have some spare time. So this is going to be more off the top of my head, so my thoughts might not be as collected as it would be if I wanted to present my case better. But basically, sure. I saw that you were talking about abortion, obviously the Supreme Court ruling today, and I agree. Well, obviously there's a legal aspect and then there's a moral aspect, and you could categorize it in many different ways. I wanted to call today about the ramifications of like completely making it illegal or keeping it legal, and what I think those ramifications would be if we got it wrong on either side. So I would present it this way. So abortion is either something that, number one, prevents a human person's life coming into existence, or number two, ends a human person's life which is already in existence. So I would divide it that way. And then I would say this. If it's number one, if it's something that just prevents a human life coming into existence, then it's in principle exactly like a lot of the other forms of contraception which we have available. It may do it further down the line, but in principle it's just like one of those. So let's say it's something that just prevents human life coming into existence and we criminalize it, we don't allow people access to it, then the worst consequence of it is what people have lost one form of birth control. That's literally what the consequence would be from many available forms. Okay, so, but if it's number two, it's something that ends a human life already existent and we don't make it illegal, then we have the consequences, the continued genocide of human babies. So just looking at it from a epistemic 50-50, if you didn't know which it was, the consequence of getting it wrong on one side is much weightier than getting it wrong on the other side. And then I could give you three reasons why I think we should end it if it's number two. That is, it ends a human life.
Let's stop for a second there, John, because I do have a question. You want to give it an either or, a one or two, but my question is, what if it's a third option, that an abortion is the termination of a pregnancy? You're trying to assign, life or death on something, but the abortion is simply the termination of a pregnancy. Also, you're trying to set up a dichotomy here where there is a whole bunch more of nuance. So let's go ahead and throw those two out completely and focus on the termination of a pregnancy and whether or not that is good.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate that, but I would say that what you've said doesn't really make sense. It's based on the logical law of excluded middle. So if you count a pregnancy as a human life, then it would be number two. If you don't count a pregnancy as a human life, then it would be number one, because you would obviously assume a pregnancy leads to a human life. Oh, so you don't believe a pregnancy leads to a human life?
A pregnancy can lead to a human life, but when you're at 6 weeks, a mass of cells is not a human life. Even when you have just a heartbeat, that is not, early term abortions is not aborting a human life. It is terminating a pregnancy. And late term abortions is giving birth and letting the whatever is left, however much development it can do, see if it can come to term or not. And if it's before the, is viable, then no, it does in fact die. So again, we're at the point where we are terminating a pregnancy. The question of personhood is not something that you can just say, oh, well, it's a person at this stage, because you don't even get a social security number until you're born if you're in the United States.
Okay, well, there are arguments for whether the pregnancy is a human, but all you're telling me there is that you just believe it's something that prevents a human life coming into existence. That's what abortion would be. You're telling me you don't think it's something that ends a human life already in existence. Now, my point is, let's say you're correct and we ban it anyway, then what have we lost? We've lost one form of birth control. In principle, that's all you're doing. You what the other forms do, which is prevent the human life coming into existence. And I don't think the consequence is very big. You know, we have many medical procedures we don't just have availability to just because we want them. And so that's the consequence if we get it wrong. Now, that's assuming what you would say is right, that it's not a human life or existence. But if it is a human life or existence and we get it wrong, then it's the continued genocide of human babies, human persons, as we'd put it. So to me, the consequence is much weightier. If we were epistemic 50-50, now you might argue epistemically you believe that it's not a human life. That's a separate argument. I'm just making the argument of the consequences if we get it wrong one way or the other.
Yes, I think, John, I think this is how evangelicals, Catholics, and other Christian denominations view this issue, right? They're seeing it as, well, it is a human life, regardless. Depending on which denomination you talk to, it's a human life straight from conception, and because of this is why it is a sin. This is why it is a grave moral issue. And if that were true, if I were to believe that to be true, that it is a human life and that it is worth protecting at that stage, then I would agree with you with the premise that, yes, you are ultimately terminating the human life. However, I just don't. I don't agree with the premise that it is. I don't think it's 6 weeks it is. And as Jason's pointing out, a viability outside the womb is the factor that we consider here. We have to people talk about heartbeats and people talk about brain stems, but ultimately we don't have an objective definition to figure out what it means to be a human or a person. What I really care about in this is there suffering that's being caused. And based on my understanding of medical science and based on what I believe to be other people's understanding of medical science, when that procedure is happening, and that typically happens, it is within the first trimester, that there is not suffering that is occurring. That, in other words, a human life is not, suffering from the consequence of that decision. So if there isn't a human life suffering from the consequence of that decision, which is my understanding, then there is no moral crisis to be had here in that sense, right? Obviously, people who have religious arguments who say, well, there's a soul in there and there's something that's feeling, it has a heartbeat, it has these other things, they are going to disagree. And unfortunately, that's just not something I can work with, because I can't work with a religious argument that says one way or the other. But even in a secular sense, I don't think it has to be, as Jason pointed out, an epistemic 50-50. I understand where it can be that way, but I don't think it has to be.
Well, and my next, John, I do have one additional question, because Dan brought up suffering, and I'm sure you're gonna bring up how the fetus, the unborn child, the zygote, whatever, the soul, as it were. I don't know exactly where your definition of life actually lies, but there is more than just the suffering of the developing series of cells. There's also the suffering of the mother herself, or the uterus owner themselves.
You call her the mother. You call it the mother, which assumes that that's a human baby then.
Well, okay. Assume it's a human baby. You can call it cow mother. No. You can call it cow mother. Cow mother doesn't mean it's a human baby. That's just semantics. I don't agree with that.
Okay, so let's drop the semantics. Let's also drop the super hyperbolic language of genocide, because we will get absolutely nowhere if we are doing that. Now, I will, for the sake of this, I will walk back the term mother and say the pregnant person. Okay. And again, I'm going to use pregnant person so that we don't exclude any other uterus owners.
Yeah.
So why are we completely ignoring the well-being of the pregnant person? Because a pregnant person, we don't know their situation. We don't know if there is a medical reason, because you have not addressed that at all. We haven't addressed, in the cases of rape and incest, you've got so much nuance in there that you are choosing to ignore. And one of the things I would really like to know is why? Why do you want to ignore the nuance and just say, no, straight, this is life, this is happening? Because there's so much more in that. With this and with all the other trigger laws that are going into effect, they say that it's not going to be used in the cases of entropic pregnancies, where the embryo forms outside of the uterus. But we don't actually know if that's true, because if you make abortion illegal across the board, but you've got this little carve out, but do you actually have this carve out? Who's to say that it won't then fill in that gap and go, you know what, entropic pregnancy, just let that pregnant person die. Yeah. So can you address those issues?
Yeah, I can. You say I'm ignoring the nuance. You have to be fair here. I'm calling with one point, and that's the consequence of what would happen if we get it wrong on either side. I'm not calling to give every single possible scenario and all these things, but in terms of
why not?
Why
not?
Because I was told.
Why can't you do that? Why can't you go on other side? Why can't you figure out the full picture? Well, don't take one little snapshot. No. Don't take one little snapshot and say that this is how things are going to be, and that's that.
Yeah, but I have answers. I just got told by the person who takes the call to keep it to one subject, so I'm just calling about one thing. But I can answer you. So what specific you want to know? Specifically what my thoughts would be on if we should ban abortion for like a medical reason, if it's going to endanger the life of the mother. Is that correct?
That's one really good place to start. But, again, let's use pregnant person, not mother.
Oh, okay. So I would say this. I would say my personal position is obviously I would see the baby in the womb as a child and...
wrong.
I don't know. You say
not baby yet.
Not child. Let's say human person. So I see the
mistake number 2. Not human yet.
Okay. Well. Okay. I'm saying based on that as a premise.
It's hard, isn't it? It's really hard, and that's where we run into the problem. We run into the problem because this is such a hard subject for. Just saying either or, black and white, right and wrong. There's so much more nuance, and that's what I'm trying to get you to see, is that there's more nuance here than you are giving credit for.
No, I feel you haven't let me answer. That's the issue. It's not that, it's the nuance. So if there was let's say the child, well, okay, it's because you're not, my normal nomenclature, as you would say, is to say child. The pregnancy in the mother's stomach, in the lady's stomach or whatever, is a human person. Let's just assume that, and let's say that puts her life at risk, and then I would definitely be, a doctor has to look at and weigh the pros and cons. I would be on the side of obviously it'd be far better if one life survives rather than 2 lives die. But I would say there's a big difference between killing a person and letting people die naturally. I would say there's a big difference there. But if you can prevent 2 people dying naturally, and he has to do something like, and I won't say you try and kill the baby. Obviously, you can try and deliver the baby early and save the baby. But there's no reason, especially after 20 weeks, that you just kill the baby. You just deliver the baby early, if that's the issue. But I haven't got a problem with people who have to make these hard decisions, as long as one of the factors they do when they make these hard decisions is they look at the pregnancy as a human person, as in the equation. If they don't look at it as in the equation, if they come to a different conclusion, that's fine. But if they see it as a human person as part of the equation, then that's all I'm asking for. But my original
doctors are not even being given the choice in a lot of these laws.
Go ahead, John.
Doctors are not even being given the choice. So,
yeah, keep going.
Sorry, the 2 people speaking, so I'm not quite sure what you're asking me to say. What was the question?
Well, it sounded like you had another point to say. If you didn't, that's fine. But just to kind of put at least get going with this conversation here is that I understand what you're trying to say, which is that if we have to consider if it's a human person, if it's a human person, then we have to respect its rights, its desires, it's what it would want, etc. I think the issue that I would have, and what Jason has expressed, is that that terminology, even of itself, may not actually describe what we're talking about here. I wouldn't call an embryo a human person. I don't think it has needs. I don't think it has wants. From an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make sense for it to even have a capacity to suffer and experience pain or to experience desires when it's in that state. At least that early on, right? Like, I think like if we're talking about a baby that's a week before it's due, I think that's probably close enough to a baby where you have like, absolutely, we can get that because we have evidence that shows like, we can get babies, and at that point it is a baby, out from the earlier parts of a pregnancy. It can survive outside of the womb. But that early on, if we're talking about where statistically most abortions happen, which is within the first and sometimes second trimester, I don't think there's a problem there. I don't think we actually have to consider it a human and consider its wants or desires. That I just don't believe that the evidence is there for that. So I mean that's how I would summarize my response there, John.
Okay. Can I respond, or do you want to go to the next caller?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll let you respond, and then we'll probably wrap it up after that.
Yeah, okay. So I'll keep it brief. So basically, that argument is whether it's a human person or not. And if you remember, my initial thing was the consequence. So if abortion is something either prevents a human person coming into existence or it ends a human person's life already in existence. And like I say, what are the worst consequences? We lose one form of contraception if we ban it. I don't feel that's a big consequence if we ban it on wrong terms. And you say there's no evidence to believe it's a human person. Well, I would say there's no real strong evidence to believe it's not. And I think it does come down to what we would say in epistemology is non-inferential belief-forming mechanisms, which is just seemings. And we're not going to get to whether it's a human person or not just by inference. It's going to be something non-inferential. And so don't you think, in one sense, better that the states, the small communities decide among themselves, because it is a moral issue and we don't agree.
But no. Here's the thing, John.
No.
I don't decide. Wait. John, I don't decide whether something lives or not because it's human. That's not, first of all, I'm a vegan, okay? I want animal lives to live. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I don't do it because they're human. I do it because they have a capacity for suffering, and arguably for some animals, a capacity for reasoning on some level, but a capacity to suffering is really my main concern. It's not because they're human. It really isn't. I think that's not a good criteria. I don't think you're going to get an objective metric. I do agree we have to, you're talking about theming, right? And I think you do have to point out some of those themes of what makes life what makes a life a life and what makes that existence meaningful and worth protecting. And my criteria is suffering. That's what I've chosen to choose, because if you don't have a capacity to suffering, I don't think there's harm that's being done there, right? But anyway, John, I do appreciate you calling in. We do have some other callers that we definitely want to talk to you tonight. But thanks so much for doing that. Jason, you looked like you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah. The evidence where he's talking about there's no evidence that
right. I didn't address that.
There actually is. The fact that there is no central nervous system after before a certain point. The fact that you don't have a heartbeat before a certain point. That is not a human. That is not when you are so early in development, your evidence is there. That and we have seen it where people will put up pictures of different species of animals in different states of development, and some people would be like, "Oh, it's so terrible that they took that human baby out and aborted it." It's like, excuse me, that's actually a dolphin. That malformed or an unformed, it's a dolphin. It's not actually a human being in any way, shape, or form. No matter how you spin it, it's a completely different species. So you can't even identify. If you can't even identify it, you're done.
Yeah, a criteria for just being a human being isn't enough for me, right? Because like I would want to save my cat whenever I can, like in its interests, and it's not a human, right? And like most people would want to save their animals that they consider pets or friends, right? Like that's if we base it on other things that we have to consider the interests of, and the interests of an embryo are, in my opinion, are non-existent. It hasn't been demonstrated that it has interests. It hasn't been demonstrated that at that stage that there's something that we need to worry about. And the fact is, from an evolutionary perspective, again, it just doesn't make sense when you talk about how natural abortion really is. Really, when we're talking about abortion, we're talking about medically assisted abortions, because most conceptions don't even happen. Most conceptions don't even go to term. So if my understanding, it's about 10% of all conceptions actually go to term, right? So it's like, that doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective to have a being that can have suffering at that stage. And for all intents and purposes, it doesn't seem that we have evidence to suggest that it does. And that's what I really care about. I don't actually care that it's human. That's kind of a red herring for me. But anyway.
We've also seen where people have gotten jail time for miscarrying because of drug use. Now, that's terrible in itself, but is it possible then, with all these laws, with all this morality that's going around, that every miscarriage will be investigated like a murder? Right. And how absolutely abhorrent that is, because first, the pregnant person, because we're going to go with that right now, the pregnant person has to go through such tremendous loss, plus they have to go through an investigation, an invasive investigation, a murder investigation. That may sound a little bit hyperbolic to some people, and I get that. I do get that. However, it's not outside the realm of possibility, because we didn't think the overturning of Roe v. Wade was possible. Yeah, I think to John's point, he would probably say that, he probably isn't interested in that. I think he would be interested in investigating the interpretations of what happens when something is done intentionally, again, when it is like medically assisted. But he's not here to talk about himself, so I won't argue for him.